One. Hello and welcome to the School Safety Free Period. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
And we are with the Educators School Safety Network. Today, we have our Violence in Schools report. The official report will be coming out pretty soon. But before we got too busy into back to school, we wanted to take some time to talk a little bit informally with some previews and kind of talk about our impressions, gathering that data over the course of the year. And then obviously the big story of violence in schools last year was swatting. So we want to stop avoiding that elephant in the room and talk about it a little bit.
And that's why you listen to the podcast, because you get sneak peeks before anyone else.
I thought you were going to say, and that's why you always leave a note, but okay.
That might be too obscure of a reference, but
it's pretty mainstream.
I think prior to the actual release of the report, we can all, like you said, we can all talk about the elephant in the room, because I'm pretty sure that you might have a guess. Our listeners probably have a guess as to what some of the most significant incidents were this past school year, because you probably experienced them or know someone who did.
Yeah. So I think an important kind of just foundational thing in our research, we don't track quote unquote swatting per se. We have always tracked false reports. And that includes both intentional false reports like swatting, where someone intentionally says, oh my gosh, there's a shooter here. And it also incorporates accidental false reports. I know past school year there was one in Florida where a teacher overheard what she thought was someone talking about that there was a shooting and pushed a panic button, and the school went into a response. I can tell you kind of anecdotally, this school year, of our incredible quantity of false reports that we tracked, almost all of them were intentional false reports, or what people are commonly calling swatting.
Yeah, and I think that's important to keep in mind, that what we're going to be talking about, almost without exception, regardless of who the perpetrator is, were deliberate, intentional acts. And I think the one thing that I want to kind of say right out of the gate is that in our reports, we talk about violent threats and violent incidents. And we quantify swatting or false reports of an active shooter as a violent incident, not a threat. And people will say, well, but nothing happened. But, oh yes, something absolutely happened. It was an attack perpetrated on the school that elicited a response that made it necessary for the school to do something. So it was, in fact, an incident. When we look at threats, we look at something where maybe they're investigating, or, it turns out nothing actually happened. But in this particular case, something very specific did happen. Someone made a report, indicated there was an active shooter event. The school had to elicit a response, as well as law enforcement. So it is a deliberate attack. And so we just want to be really clear that we are quantifying them as violent incidents, not threats.
Yeah, I think to build off of that, it's sort of like, what is the distinction between a threat and swatting, right? Well, a threat is the school receives a communication. I'm going to, there's going to be. And like you said, schools do investigations, schools do take actions to address threats, but the posture of the response is it's we're investigating, we're removing students from that area out of an abundance of caution. Yes.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
In a swatting incident, there is a period of time where people think they're going to die. And we've done research, additional research with a school district that experienced a swatting incident. And yes, after the fact, hours and hours later, everyone realized, oh, we're not in danger, and maybe we never were in danger. But there is a period of time where schools are in a reactionary posture that is not investigation or abundance of caution. They are literally taking steps to try to save their lives. And
it's not a period of time like a minute or two as they listen to the call. It's a substantive period of time where everyone in the school is taking a response. It's not an administrator is investigating or asking around. Everyone in the school is enacting some kind of response that is quite literally the most dramatic response that one can take. And that is to figure out how to survive an active shooter event. So it is most definitely an attack.
Yeah. So of the incidents that we tracked in the 22-23 school year, fully 63% of all of the incidents were swatting incidents. So obviously this is an incredibly outsized quantity of the things that schools dealt with, the things that schools had to respond to in terms of violence in school. 63% of them were swatting.
So every time there was an incident in a school, and there's always a wide array of incidents in schools, whether that elicit or require some kind of response, typically outside the capabilities of the school. But we know that there's a wide array. And so typically our percentages are less than 20% for any given incident over the years that we've done this. It's usually, 15% or less, because there's such a wide diversity of incidents. So it's really unheard of in our research to have this incredibly high number of 63% of all the incidents that a school dealt with were actually swatting. Keeping in mind, that means 63% of the incidents, they believe there was an active shooter happening in their school.
Yeah. So I guess we kind of want to preview two questions about swatting. And I think the first one is, why do we think that this happened? What are some potential explanations or some potential context for why there was this incredible quantity, 446 swatting incidents, and some of those, it is just that so many schools in a school district experienced swatting that they were even counted one, even though it's potentially multiple incidents. So that's the first question, why, and some context. And then I think importantly, the second question, so what can we do about it? Going into this next school year, what are the lessons that we can learn? What are the things that we can do to set ourselves up for success, to maybe be less significantly impacted by a swatting incident? So do you want to start with the first one, kind of the why and the context?
Yeah, I think the question why is why, because it works. Yeah. It is really from the viewpoint of the attacker, it is exactly what you're looking for. You're looking for chaos, fear, anxiety, disruption, undermining the trust in the institution, creating the perception that this place isn't safe. And so that used to be, a kid that would say in chemistry in front of 10 kids, oh, I think I'm going to shoot up the school. And, 10 kids would hear it. And then it was social media, which is maybe, 100 people would share it or see it, or 1,000 people. And now you've taken the unknown of potentially maybe it's going to be something happening, and pivoted to there is something happening, without having to actually do it.
Yeah.
So you can have an outsized impact on a school by saying this thing is happening, and by doing it multiple schools simultaneously. And you don't even have to be in the country. You don't have to have any relationship with the school. You can do incredible numbers of attacks. And it's really about trying to undermine that perception and belief of safety, and weaponize the fear that we all have about a potential active shooter, and weaponize it against the school community. So people do it because it works. There's going to be a response. There isn't going to be a school that goes, that's probably fake. Let's wait and see if there's actually a shooter.
Right.
We're going to respond.
Yeah. I want to call out a couple things that you mentioned about the reach and the scope of what we saw this year. I mean, it seems to me that swatting is almost the combination of what we've always seen, right? School-based threats, violent threats against schools, plus the technology of robocalling. Anyone who has a cell phone is aware of how problematic and prolific robocalling is, the capability to spoof numbers, whether you're within this country or, as you mentioned, that there is, and I don't want to get too far afield from the work that we do because we're not law enforcement. We don't have details about the investigation of these, right, but sort of the stuff that has been published. It seems that there are a fair number of these calls that are originating from outside of the United States. And so you're seeing that sort of marriage between old-timey school threats, right, plus the technology that allows people to be able to do it from very far away. They may have absolutely no connection to the school whatsoever, other than that they were able to find the phone number or find the non-emergency number for a locality. and that you're able to do it at scale. So I think that's one kind of interesting thing. And then you also kind of mentioned the evolution from a student in class saying, quote, a threat or saying something. And there is sort of the preponderance that a lot of these swatting incidents were not, in fact, students, were not people who had any connection. And so that's kind of a different shift from what we've seen historically in our research from, like you said, a kid who doesn't want to take a test or wants anxiety and fear and disruption on like a low, teen, like a misguided teen mischief scale. And what we're seeing in swatting it is really something different.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen different law enforcement entities refer to it as almost a terrorist attack, where, the point of a terrorist attack is to undermine, to create fear, to make you feel like you aren't safe anywhere. Mm-hmm. And when you have this incredibly high rate of swatting, even when you know that it is just quote unquote swatting, there is almost this underlying anxiety that we saw last year of schools going, are we next? When are we going to get one? Yep. And so even when you know that it is not an actual active shooter, it still creates anxiety and fear and undermines that perception of safety and, frankly, the trust in the institution. Mm-hmm. And it's coming at a very kind of unique point in our society where there is a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of, division, mistrust of institutions, mm-hmm. and then a lot of mental health concerns and all these other different things mm-hmm. that are going on that make this swatting act so much powerful than it might have been, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah. So I think that's some interesting context and kind of the why. And I think the next question that we kind of posed was, so what can we do about it? What can we do to set ourselves up for success? And I think one really insidious part of swatting is that it creates a situation where you have response fatigue, right? If there have been 446 swatting incidents last year, you know that there are people who are going into their schools this year going, well, if we get a report of an active shooter, it could just be swatting. Maybe I don't need to respond as rapidly or as seriously. And I think that's a really dangerous concern. And so we've had a lot of discussions, Dr. Klinger and I, about what does that mean to have some more tools in the toolbox so that we can respond very rapidly while we determine, is this swatting? Is there really violence here? But how can we have those tools be measured such that we can respond very rapidly, but then when it is determined that there isn't actually a threat, that we can de-escalate that response so that we don't have kind of what we colloquially call kids peeing in buckets. Because when you talk about the impact, the impact of a swatting incident is more outsized the longer and more intense our response is. And I get it. We haven't been in one of these incidents, and so it's you don't want to Monday morning quarterback something like this, but I think it would be valuable for schools to develop more capabilities to be able to quickly shift and scale that response from the initial, oh my gosh, this could be a real thing, we have to respond very, very seriously, very, very rapidly, to downshifting to, well, nothing has been, there is no threat, there's law enforcement all over the place. How can we shift our response so that it's a way that's a little bit less stressful, less traumatic for students and teachers? You want to kind of speak to that?
Well, I think probably it seems very common sense, but I think probably the most effective is to have the discussions we're having now, mm-hmm. to have the discussions, to understand the rate of swatting, why it matters, what are the underlying costs in terms of loss of instruction, consuming resources, anxiety and fear, undermining the institution, all those kinds of things, having those discussions about what we're up against so that people understand that there could potentially be one of two things at work when an incident occurs. Mm-hmm. It could be a potential actual event that we need to respond to, but it also could be this false report. And so can we end up somewhere in the middle instead of completely dismissing and saying, oh, it's just another one of those, or absolutely, getting completely immersed in the idea that we're not going to survive this event.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think really having the discussion about that, but also having the discussion about all the different components of school safety rather than just, we only know how to do an active shooter. We don't know how to do a lower level lockdown. We don't know, we don't have a good communication plan. So we don't have a way to disseminate that we believe this is a potential swatting incident, but we want to shelter the kids and be safe.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're working with an all or nothing proposition, we're either jumping out windows and locking down for 6 hours, or we're just going to assume it's okay. Like most things, we would probably be better served to try to build the capabilities to kind of meet in the middle, to have other options, as you mentioned, other tools in the toolbox, a lower level of lockdown, more communication options, discussions with students and teachers and parents of what that looks like, how we're going to respond while we buy time to make sure that it is in fact a swatting event. So it all really starts with having that conversation with all of the stakeholders.
Yeah, I want to expand on what you said about communication. To me, that seems like the biggest key here, and I think really the area where a little bit of pre-work, it could be really, really valuable in a swatting incident, or really in any of these other types of violent incidents or accidents, or kind of from an all hazards approach. I think you mentioned of making sure that we have our communication capabilities. Do we have a good plan? What are the official ways that we're going to communicate with, from administration to faculty and staff in an incident? Yeah. How are we going to communicate with our parents and our community and our stakeholders? Do those things really work the way we think they work? That's something that we see a lot. That, in theory, you go to a school and you ask, well, what's the communication plan? How would that work? How would you communicate? Well, in theory, we would do this, this, and this. Okay, have you tested that? Does it actually work? If you are planning on relying on your cell phones, which is a whole nother episode, a whole nother discussion, does everybody have cell phone service? Can people hear the PA? Can people get push notifications? And to really kind of work through what is the communication plan, and then importantly, do we have redundancy? Because if we're dealing with a swatting incident, your infrastructure, your technological infrastructure will probably continue to work. But if we're talking about a community-wide severe weather event, your normal communications infrastructure might not be operational. So I think that's a really, really valuable one to spend a lot of time on. And again, like we kind of always harp on, that doesn't have to be scary or traumatic to think about. How would I get information? How would I communicate out? How would I receive critical information?
And having those conversations. And I think it's kind of ironic that in the swatting sphere, if you will, the schools that have only done active shooter, and that's all they've ever trained for or talked about, actually tend to be less prepared for a swatting incident. Because they only know how to go 100 miles an hour. They don't know how to take a more measured response. And I think that really has some value for people to think about as they come back. So if we're saying we're going to do an active shooter drill, and our only options are the kids blow it off, they think it's ridiculous, or the kids are so scared they're crying and writing on their messages on their arms to their parents. If those are our only two options, we're not doing this quite right.
Yeah.
And so again, if that's what happens in the drill, think about how can we interpret that or extrapolate that out to when we have a swatting event? Can we do something that is in the middle of nobody cares, everyone thinks it's funny and ridiculous, or everyone is so traumatized? Can we come to a middle sort of response? And if the only thing we've ever done is try to scare people into submission with a active shooter drill, and we've never had all these other conversations like you've alluded to, and we've never done any other kind of trainings of less aggressive measures, a school is going to find themselves in that making that dichotomous choice. Neither one of those decisions is going to be right in a swatting event. It's that hitting sort of in the middle where we can toggle up when we have evidence to suggest that there really is something happening, and we can toggle down when we begin to understand that it's really another one of those swatting incidents.
Yeah.
I think that response, that measured response, would be really beneficial.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said about the schools that only trained on active shooter actually had worse experiences or report having, worse experiences in swatting incidents. And I think that kind of belies this undercurrent of when the only thing that we prepare for is active shooter, there is this sort of necessity to cut corners, right? If we're dealing with the true life or death situation, then these littler things don't matter. Students with special needs having real difficulty doesn't matter. Students who need access to their medicine doesn't matter. Kids peeing in buckets doesn't matter. True, if we're dealing with the true life or death situation, we do have to cut corners because we are dealing with trying to preserve life. And if we haven't prepared for other types of situations where maybe it is important that the kids have access to their medicine, or maybe it is important that we are not needlessly traumatizing our students with social and emotional needs, then that's a kind of a different thing, like you had mentioned, of toggling up and toggling down. And if we only have one speed, if
we've got 0 or 100,
Yeah.
and that's it, maybe 80 would be a more appropriate response for a swatting event. But we find schools that are forced into an all or nothing response.
Yeah. So obviously, as you can tell, there's a ton more to unpack. As we have the report, I think in upcoming episodes, we'll be able to show a little bit more of that data and what that looks like. And some of the other findings, when you take away the big elephant in the room, swatting, there's other interesting insights from the report from last year. So obviously there'll be plenty more to come, and always we want to make sure that we have that focus with helpful, actionable stuff for educators, not just admiring the problem, although some of it is very, very interesting. We want to make sure that we're moving forward with kind of helpful stuff.
Well, and I think the big question that we're going to address in the coming weeks is, are we going to see this kind of level of swatting as we move into the 23-24 school year? And I don't know that, but what I do know is schools have better had some conversations about it, because there is a likelihood that there is at least going to be those kind of swatting events again. So we can't just chalk this up to, wow, that was a weird, wacky school year.
Mm-hmm.
We have to assume that at least right now, as long as this trend is working, we're going to see those potential things happening again.
And I think it's important to note that swatting or any type of threat will be less effective the better we get at preparing ahead of time. If the intended outcome is chaos, fear, anxiety, disruption, if a school is prepared, has talked about this, has several tools in the toolbox, they've practiced, they know their communication plan, when a swatting incident happens at their school and they're able to quickly respond, quickly determine there isn't a threat, and quickly go back to business as usual, swatting will become a lot less effective, and it will happen a lot less.
That's a great point. If we want to stop swatting, we need to get better at responding to it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining. As usual, if you have any questions, you can always shoot us an email, info@eschoolsafety.org, and we'd love to answer your questions. Also, if you head to our website, eschoolsafety.org, we have tons of free resources, lots of other information, and lots of things to get you started on this school safety journey as you head into the next school year. I'm sorry to say a dirty word for teachers. I know it's not even August yet, and I'm talking about the next school year, so I do apologize. But thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.